Hello, how are you? Many people feel bloated and heavy with that uncomfortable gassy feeling, the sensation that the intestines never fully empty, and they often complain that they suffer a great deal from constipation. Today I'm going to explain to you why this happens, whether you really do accumulate stool in your intestines, pounds of stool or not, and how to get rid of that stool that gets stuck with that feeling of not being able to eliminate everything that was in your gut. You're going to love this video, so stay until the end because you won't want to miss it. Before we start, I want to ask you if you suffer from constipation and what's the longest you've ever gone without being able to go to the bathroom. Write it for me down here in the comments. I'd love to see your response. If you can, also take a moment to like the video. That really helps me out here on the channel. It shows YouTube that you support the channel and trust my content. And if you know someone who really struggles with constipation, share this video. Let's expand our circle of good together. Constipation can be a chronic problem for many people, right? I know a lot of people who say they've suffered from this since childhood and have all these symptoms, Often there's that feeling of a bloated, swollen belly and gas. You go to the bathroom, but the stool breaks apart in the middle of a bowel movement, and it feels like you couldn't get everything out of your intestines. In some cases, there are even fissures and bleeding because of this difficulty in evacuating. Many people who have this condition have slower intestinal transit and drier stools, because the longer you go without having a bowel movement, the more water is reabsorbed in that part of the large intestine. The large intestine has a very important function of reabsorbing water for our body, but if the stool stays there for too long, it gets drier and harder over time. This makes it even harder for you to actually have a bowel movement. Besides that, the longer the stool stays there, the more the carbohydrates and sugars present in it ferment, causing more gas, bloating, and intestinal discomfort. That bloating, that more swollen belly that many people complain about. So, when someone has a bowel movement after being constipated for many days with a slower and more constipated intestine, the scale often goes down as well, and that's because of those stools that were stuck, the water that's eliminated, and the gases that were released. So, a lot of people say, oh my God, I lost 2 pounds on the scale just because I went to the bathroom. And yes, in some cases, it really can get to that point depending on how long you went without a bowel movement and how much stool was accumulated. It can be a very significant amount for some people because it's not just the stool, it's also the water and the gases. Now, to say that it's going to be pounds and pounds, that's already very unlikely, right? Because if you think about it, there's just no way all of that could fit in your intestines. Even though the intestines are several meters long, our body naturally tends to eliminate this little by little. So, unless someone has had a severe case of intestinal obstruction, saying that there are many pounds of feces is already an exaggeration that normally doesn't match the reality for the vast majority of people. And that's a good thing, right? Because just imagine if you really had all that weight of feces in your intestines, your body would definitely feel it. So, the main idea is to avoid constipation because, as I mentioned, the longer your intestines stay inactive, the harder it will be for you to have a bowel movement later due to water reabsorption, fermentation, and so on. So, ideally, we should have regular intestinal transit. There isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution. Everyone is different. But ideally, you should be able to have a bowel movement at least every other day. Some people have bowel movements every day, and some go more than once a day. And ideally, for you to know whether you're constipated or not, you should pay attention to the consistency of your stool. It is important to look at the toilet bowl when you have a bowel movement, because ideally, your stool should look like a sausage, soft, long, and in one piece. If your stool is very dry in small pellets, what we call goat droppings, that already shows they are very hard and probably related to a more advanced stage of constipation. So it's also important that when you have a bowel movement, you feel like you've completely emptied your bowels. Because when the stool is very dry, as I mentioned, sometimes it breaks apart. Sometimes you can't really have that peristalsis, that intestinal movement to push the stool out, and all of this makes things more difficult. So our goal is for you to be able to eliminate this byproduct of digestion, which is stool, without having these unpleasant sensations associated with it. Many people complain that they can't have a proper bowel movement, that they spend many hours sitting, sometimes literally hours, straining and trying to stimulate themselves just to be able to go. This isn't productive for you. In fact, it can even be contraindicated to stay sitting for so long because you put a lot of strain on those muscles. You force a lot of blood flow to that area, which can increase the risk of hemorrhoids and even prolapse. So the way you sit on the toilet often doesn't help either, because ideally your legs should be a little more elevated so that your rectum is in a more anatomical position for the passage of stool. A good tip is that you can place a small stool in front of the toilet to raise your legs and make it easier to have a bowel movement. This increases the ease of evacuation without making the pain worse, especially for those who already have more advanced constipation. And it's not some trick, it's actually biomechanics, and it really does help with the evacuation process. And a lot of people also struggle with issues like gas and bloating, and this issue of gas and bloating is related, as I mentioned, to the excessive fermentation of carbohydrates that were present in your stool, often due to an imbalanced microbiota. The longer the stool stays there, the higher the risk of growth of bacteria that aren't so healthy for us. And these bacteria feed a lot on sugar and simple carbohydrates. This slow transit also contributes to the buildup of gas and can lead to intestinal hypersensitivity. So your belly gets more bloated throughout the day, you might feel discomfort that gets worse at night, and your weight can really fluctuate a lot for these people because of this bloating and abdominal distension. Sometimes the amount of gas is so great that your belly looks much more bloated than it would after a bowel movement. So this can also be something that really worsens the visual appearance. Another thing we always have to take into account is the emotional aspect, because we know there's a strong connection between the brain and the gut, and we know that the nervous system, the small intestine, and the large intestine are all regulated by the autonomic nervous system. So, stress, being in a hurry, anxiety, and lack of routine can all impact your intestinal transit. That's why some people can only have a bowel movement at home. When they travel, they can't go to the bathroom, they can't go when they're out. That's also why, when you're very stressed, you might get diarrhea, or on the other hand, everything gets blocked up, because all of this can be related to this neurophysiological aspect. So if you're already really stressed and you say, oh my God, I need to have a bowel movement right now or else it's going to get worse, that will only make your situation worse. So try to have a routine, but without putting pressure on yourself, so that this doesn't become yet another issue that will make your situation worse. So let's talk about things that will actually help you eliminate that stool that's stuck, and for some people, it's a large amount, right? We're not talking about pounds, but often it really is quite a lot, and it causes discomfort, that heavy feeling, gas, and bloating. So one thing you need to understand is that we have a sort of tripod that really helps our bowel function, which is fiber, water to hydrate that fiber, and healthy fats. When we have these three things, the intestines work better because fiber can attract water to itself, especially soluble fiber, which is why water is important here. So oats, lentils, flaxseed, chia, and psyllium are great options for you to add to your daily routine because they absorb water, form a gel, and increase the fecal bulk, which sends a signal to the vagus nerve to trigger peristalsis. Insoluble fiber also plays a very interesting role. Although it doesn't absorb water, it also increases the volume of the fecal bulk. But soluble fiber is preferred in these cases because it actually absorbs water and also helps to moisten and soften the stool even more. Fat actually helps to further moisten the stool, making it easier to lubricate the digestive tract, so that when it's time to have a bowel movement, you don't experience excessive dryness. So, I've already mentioned chia and flaxseed. They also play a role here. Avocado also contains fiber and fat. Olive oil is a wonderful fat. In short, any healthy fat that you consume regularly will help with this trio of fiber, water, and good fat, promoting healthy intestinal transit. The most important thing in these cases is consistency. Of course, in the first few days, you might even eat a slightly larger amount, but it doesn't need to be anything excessive. The most important thing is that you regularly include these foods in your diet every day, so your intestines understand that this is a routine. Another food, or rather another group of foods that also helps a lot to prevent constipation and eliminate trapped stool, are probiotics. Probiotics are precisely the beneficial bacteria and yeasts that live in our intestines. And remember, I told you that when stool is stuck, we get a greater growth of bad bacteria, which feed on sugar and these, byproducts of our diet. So when we manage to consume yogurt, kefir, fermented foods like cabbage and cucumber, there's a playlist here of natural probiotic foods, homemade, naturally fermented. You can recolonize your gut with good foods, with good bacteria and yeast from these foods, and improve your gut flora. Prebiotics are the food for probiotics. So in fact, soluble fibers are usually already prebiotic. So if you really focus on fibers and probiotics, that helps a lot with intestinal function and can even help as a complementary approach in cases of dysbiosis. Another very important thing to remember is that our intestine is a muscle. We can't contract the intestine the way we contract a bicep, right? It's a muscle that we can't move voluntarily. It's the brain that controls it. So, the most important thing is for you to move other muscles to further stimulate your intestine's function. So, for example, you can't contract your stomach, you can't contract your uterus. In the case of women, you can't contract your intestine because it's the brain that sends the signal. You don't have control over it. But for example, you can do a sit-up, and that way, indirectly, you end up moving those abdominal muscles. You can do a squat, and then you also use your core, those deeper muscles, to maintain posture, and that also works your abdomen. So ideally, you should be able to move your body because studies have already shown that people who are more physically active can also experience improvements in their bowel movements. This also greatly benefits intestinal peristalsis and helps trigger the urge to have a bowel movement. Be careful with those internet promises about medicines for intestinal cleansing, laxatives that you buy without really knowing what you're taking, or so-called miracle teas you purchase, because many times they may contain medications mixed in, so that's dangerous. Besides that, even teas you can make at home, like senna tea, which you prepare yourself, do have a laxative effect, but it feels like you're going to die when you take senna tea. I don't know if you've ever taken it in your life, but it causes a lot of cramps, a lot of intestinal pain, and it's extremely harsh on your gut flora. It's very irritating to the mucous membrane, so while it does produce a result, it actually makes your gut health much worse, increases inflammation, and even worse, it's a tea that can cause dependency. You might end up only being able to have a bowel movement when you have this strong stimulus. So if you need to use a laxative, make sure it's always under the guidance of a doctor or nutritionist who has seen you in your city, and preferably use a bulk-forming laxative, right? Like psyllium, for example, or some other laxative that helps attract more. One with higher osmolarity, which helps draw more water into the stool, hydrating it and making it easier to pass. Not an irritant laxative like senna tea or those other teas which can cause related problems. Lastly, it's worth remembering that chronic constipation is not normal, and it can even be a sign of a more serious health problem. If your stools frequently have blood, if you feel pain when having a bowel movement, if you have been losing weight without dieting, if you have recently had a change in your bowel habits, in other words, you used to have normal bowel movements and now your stools are more difficult to pass or have a different shape, like a ribbon shape. If you have a family history of colon cancer or intestinal polyps, it's very important that you see a doctor, okay? Your stools also reflect your health, and constipation can also be a sign of something more serious. Remember that this video is for informational purposes only, and if you have any questions, consult your nutritionist or your doctor in your city. So I want to know if you're going to make any of these changes. I'd love to see your comment. Remember to like the video, it really helps me out, and share it with someone who will enjoy it or who needs it. Let's work together to spread this chain of good, because that's what I want here on the channel. See you next time. Bye.